Welcome back to Bisexual Killjoy, the place where we know bisexuality isn't a phase, it's a phenomenon. I'm Bailey, and this is...
Lynn. In Season 1, Episode 7, we started a conversation about the relationship between bisexuality and gender fluidity. We explored the different kinds of binary correlations that exist between gender and sexuality, and how they're so often performed in visible or exaggerated ways. While we cite their work literally all the time, for that episode in particular, Dr. Rosie Nelson's understanding of the intersection of gender and plurisexuality was our focal point. Today, we're very excited to expand on that same conversation with Dr. Rosie Nelson as our guest.
Dr. Rosie Nelson is a senior lecturer in gender at the University of Bristol, England. Their work revolves around queer theory, bisexual identities, LGBTQ+ politics, and qualitative research methodologies, which are my favorite. They recently published Making Space for Bi+ Identities, Explorations of Genders, Identities, and Relationships, published by Routledge, and are currently in the process of completing a SAGE textbook entitled Queer and Feminist Approaches to Qualitative Research Methods. Thank you again so much for being here today, Dr. Nelson.
No worries at all. What a warm welcome. Thank you for having me.
We are very excited to get this conversation started and talk about the root development of identity and how it just plays such a pivotal role. I'm genuinely really excited to have this conversation with you. I cannot overemphasize how insightful and pivotal your work has been to my own research, but even more so to my own self-understanding as a presumed woman is what I like to call myself, like other people often presume I am. And it has definitely been really insightful. I'm especially touched by the dedication in your book on bi+ identities, where it's like, for everyone who ever needed a book like this, I know I did, and I definitely know that when I picked it up, I was like, wow, this is everything that I have been searching for and haven't found in articles at all.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really great to hear. I'm so glad that it had that sort of impact both on your scholarship and personally. You know, as the dedication indicates, it's something that meant a lot to me personally as well as professionally as well. So I'm really glad it's been useful.
Absolutely. And, you know, Lynn and I come from two very different schools of thought and backgrounds. So whereas Lynn is in sociology, I'm more in the medical side of things. And while this is something that I think about in my personal life, it's not something I often see in the medical research side of the world. And it's like, how do we get intersectionality to happen on a grander scale? But Lynn, what do you think about that intersection?
I think that working at the intersection of bisexuality and gender, it often reaffirms the gender binary, where the experiences of bi+ folks tend to be segregated into either experiences of cisgender men or cisgender women. And I think that Dr. Nelson's work was the first, and I want to say the only academic literature that I encountered that explicitly chose to address the relationship that bi+ people have regarding the gender binary in a way that explored gender fluidity. The same way that I experience fluidity in attraction, that really translated so easily into gender. And that was so hard to find in terms of, well, what's the language for that? How do I talk about that? And in episode 7, we did talk at length about my own complex relationship with gender and how much it had to do with the social context I found myself in, especially as it related to language. Being bilingual, it is so much easier for me to say that I'm a woman in Spanish and when I'm back home and just living life because of how heavily gendered the language is. And then as I found myself in the States and I just didn't refer to myself in any gendered way for a really long time, it was like, well, what's happening? So I'm curious, Dr. Nelson, how does your sexuality relate to your gender?
Well, I think that's a really important starting point for any of my work that sort of led into any of this, because really it started from a point of wanting to understand those connections. I mean, I identify as bisexual. We could talk about labels forever, but, you know, like bisexual / queer / whatever, you know. And it was very difficult for me to get to that point personally. You know, I'm 32 years old now, and I started to realize it when I was 16. And at the time, there wasn't that much conversation, representation. I didn't actually know the word existed until I was 16. And then it was like a light bulb moment. And then sort of having that moment, which started from this point of view of sexuality. Obviously, I'm a big nerd. Obviously, I wouldn't be a lecturer if I wasn't a giant nerd. And so I just kept trying to research the hell out of it. And the problem is that the only literature that I was engaging with or able to find in the course of my undergraduate degree and then later my master's degree was literature related to lesbian and gay experiences. And I felt a really clear affinity to this because, it was someone else who was a minoritized sexuality. And perhaps it was also people I was dating. I was dating lesbian people. So understanding their experience through that literature was very helpful. But it never felt like it answered any questions that I had about myself and my role. So that sort of led me to start looking into it and exploring it. And why I developed the book that you're referring to is actually based on my PhD work. So that is what generated that, is actually just kind of feeling pissed off and just wanting to tell people that I existed. It was real and there were other people like me, so it was very grounded in a very personal experience. In terms of how the gender came into it, it initially started because in doing my sort of cursory research ahead of the PhD and putting together a proposal, then I realized that most of the research I was encountering was about cis women, and usually cis white women as well, cis white middle-class women. And so we were only really getting one type of result, right? And I knew from experience of my dating life that sort of my experience of dating men and of dating women was very different because it was a very gendered experience in itself. I would behave differently with men versus how I would behave with women when I was on dates with different genders. And so this became a really central component of my initial research because I wanted to speak to people who represented different experiences in terms of their gender. And at the time, I wasn't very aware of trans and non-binary theory and lives and experiences. And it's actually almost by accident that became quite an integral part of the research, just in terms of who began to respond to the research and wanted to participate in it. I was just, it was kind of unintentional in terms of my sampling strategy, but then actually made the project so much richer. And it was very fortuitous for me because in speaking to people who identified as non-binary or on the margins of different gender, another light bulb popped up. And it was actually in the course of conducting this research that I realized that I more strongly identified with a non-binary gender identity. And that was a bit of a kick up the bum. And I think something that's very common to people who research their own experiences. You have a sort of stunning reckoning at some point. But all of this came to the point, I'm someone who believes that research is not a objective process. It's very subjective. It's imbued with a lot of power. I could talk about that for 100 years because that's where a lot of my interest into qualitative methodologies comes into. And I think that some of my own personal experiences and journey relating to all of these different aspects of my own identity filtered into what became a very interesting sort of starting point for analyzing the results of the participants. So they became the focus. And that's why I think that sort of, gender and sexuality for me are completely inextricable. I think that you can't really talk about one without talking about the other for many, many fundamental reasons. And I'm sure we'll get into some of those. But, I see them as very strongly together. And personally, as a qualitative researcher, it actually started from the personal as well. So that's a little bit of how I got into it.
Yeah, I think we can definitely resonate with that, especially from, first of all, the spite component, right? You're like, there isn't enough, so I'm going to do it myself and I'll show you. But also this idea of learning so much about yourself when you do qualitative research, when you start talking to people about their lived experience. And it's very important to me and to Lynn, but I would love to know, what place does community, not just in a research context, but in a personal context, have in helping the individual discuss gender and sexuality matters?
Absolutely. I mean, the community is, where you are able to place yourself in a community, or the communities that you find available to you, matter in terms of how you understand yourself, right? So, for example, for the average cis heterosexual person who is in a sort of, it could be any space, a more conservative space, a more progressive space, whatever, their experiences are going to be continuously reflected to themselves because they are cis and heterosexual. And that is, unfortunately, what a lot of our sort of social cultural experience is based on, heteronormativity, cis normativity, the expectation that you are heterosexual or cis and, you can marry, you can have a baby the old-fashioned way, etc. for most people. And so for anyone who sort of steps out of that, immediately what is different about you becomes evident. And that experience of difference becomes important. And I think that can easily slip into gender and sexuality. So if your sexuality is something other than what is expected, it's going to, take precedence. Same for gender. And, we can see that in terms of things like sexism and patriarchy for cis people, but we can also see it in terms of transphobia, a complete ignorance of non-binary identities and, so on, that they become really remarkable. So communities can make it more evident to the individual, first of all, but it can also be a potential space to facilitate it. Because for those lucky enough to find a truly queer space, and I mean queer in the sense of sort of its political meaning, the radical unpacking and dissembling of traditional sexuality and gender identities, for those who find themselves in a truly queer space, then a lot more opportunity presents itself. And that was for me what happened, right? I figured out I was non-binary because I suddenly found myself thrust into conversations that I hadn't had the experience of finding before, right? So community can both facilitate and restrict identities flourishing, in my opinion. That doesn't mean that anyone can't be an identity in a more conservative space where they can't see themselves, but that it might just make it more evident and more difficult in some ways. And this applies everywhere, right? Like we know that in LGBTQ and queer communities, then there are experiences and continued threads of racism, ableism, xenophobia, etc., right? These places aren't necessarily idyllic spaces of queer flourishing, but it can facilitate other things like sexuality and gender expression, for example.
I find that to be incredibly pivotal and how so many of these spaces can also be thoroughly racialized. And I think that they definitely reveal these inextricable links. Expanding on how gender and sexuality just cannot really be separated. I'm remembering that article on what do bisexuals look like? I don't know. How gender performance and signaling are... I see Bailey laughing, and we had a whole episode talking about the uniform and the Doc Martens and the Converse.
I am so salty about bi-signaling. I'm so sorry. I'm curious if you could expand a little bit more on how that has come up in your research, how important that has been, how performing gender is, I want to say, almost the only way that signaling is perceived out in the wild.
Absolutely, yeah. It's so huge because, this was something I was really interested in because at the time I was doing research, then I was sort of single and dating around, right? And I kept finding myself sort of queering up when I was going out with a woman because I'm perceived as a woman, and straightening out when I was going out with a man because, again, I was still perceived as a woman. And I was just really fascinated by this and wanted to know how people got on with it. So it became quite an interesting conversation in the interviews that I was conducting. And that led to that article you're referencing, where someone in an interview said, what does a bi person look like? I don't know. And sort of was really uncertain about it because we were talking in these interviews about how sort of there are very cultural things that you can draw on for like what a woman looks like, what a man looks like, what a lesbian looks like, what a straight woman looks like, and it was a lot of it revolved around things like hair, makeup, body hair, the kind of outfits people wear, the kind of tone of voice people use, and so on and so forth as sort of these signaling mechanisms. And so I kept sort of asking people, do you want to be seen as bisexual? Like, first of all, do you want to be understood and recognized in public as bisexual? And most people really wanted that. Of course, there's safety concerns, right? So they wanted it where they knew it would be safe. So they also wanted a ability to look bisexual that they could potentially cover in certain spaces. So in thinking about this, I kept sort of asking people, okay, how do you do that? What does that look like? What would that mean to you? How would you signal to other people? And it's basically having this sort of internal language of kind of messing up with gender a little bit, right? So a lot of participants would say, like, I'll try and wear something feminine and masculine at the same time to try and indicate that there's something a little bit off, which for those in the know, aka other queer people, they might be able to identify. But cis heterosexual people, it might phase over their heads if they're in the more conservative space, thus meaning that they were in a position of safety, right? So people would refer, the main thing at the time was badges, like little pins that sort of said, whatever, a little flag or something like that, or something to do with cats was quite common, if I recall, for women specifically, things like that. For men, it might be sort of like putting on nail varnish, but otherwise sort of having a conventional masculine outfit, these sort of hints and tips. But the conversation always returned to the fact that it was never completely clear and it wasn't because we're sort of in this social system where, it's very binary how we tend to understand people, right? Like, are you a man, are you a woman, are you straight, are you gay, whatever. There's quite a binary, snap reaction to understanding that. And bi people, in trying to surf that ambiguity, would often find themselves sorted out to one side or the other, regardless of their intention. I wonder, because this research was conducted a few years ago now, and I wonder if that would actually still be the same today, because sort of, with all these conversations around Gen Z and sort of them continuing to dissemble sexuality and gender, particularly through things like TikTok and social media, I wonder if that would still be the same findings today. Someone do the research.
Yeah, definitely doing the research. Mm-hmm. But I'm curious about the interviews that you did, when it comes to the bi cycle or fluidity and experiencing attraction over time. Did any participants in your research mention struggling with the choice of label or the label changing over time?
Oh, God, yeah. This was a huge thing for people. I mean, there's two sides to this. First of all, the idea of the sexuality label and then the gender label, which were two things that people really tended to have to sort through, regardless of their relationship to gender, whether they were trans, non-binary or cis. It was quite interesting. But in relation to sexuality, this was a huge thing because people found it really difficult to stake a identity that was considered so contentious. Because, bisexuality is first of all, it's not like a very nice sounding word. It has to be said. It sounds quite, medicalized in some way, doesn't it? It's not like queer, which is a bit funner. But also it's very clear in what it's indicating, right? That there is a multiplicitous sexual attraction. But then some people got caught up in this bi versus pan debate in terms of sort of which one is most trans inclusive and which one caters to most expressions of gender and where do I put myself in that situation. And some people felt like other labels were more useful, like demisexual or asexual, to indicate the interest in sex rather than sort of an attraction to gender. So there was a very huge diversity in terms of the labels that people identified with when I conducted my research. And at the same time, there was a huge amount of uncertainty regarding how much someone could stake their claim. Because sometimes people would email me ahead of sampling and say a bit of a history of their sexuality and sort of say, I've done this, but I haven't done this. I've dated this kind of person, but I haven't dated this kind of person. Am I valid to be interviewed? And I'd be like, yeah, come on, let's all talk. And I think that this taps into this cultural idea that bisexuality particularly is 50-50, which is a completely inadequate understanding of what bisexuality looks like. It's not a 50% attraction to men, a 50% attraction to women. Because first of all, there's more genders than that. But also, it can change. It seems kind of flippant. But I try to explain it to people who don't understand this sometimes as almost being like a preference in hair color. Sometimes I'm attracted to brunettes, sometimes I'm attracted to blondes. And, that's a very flippant way of trying to explain complex gender dynamics. But it's not universally 50-50 and it completely changes and it can be vibesy. Some people spoke about how the fact it's seasonal for them. Some people spoke about how over several years it might change, that it's not 50-50. So people really struggled with their labels as a consequence of this social messaging, but it had to be half-half though, So I'd say there's a huge amount of uncertainty around the labels. And this extended to some extent in relation to gender labels for many. I remember asking a fair few cis people how they understood their gender. And, some of the responses I remember just being as I've just always been a woman or whatever. So it's basically a routine. It's just what I use to fill out paperwork more so than sort of being anything substantive that I think about on the daily. Of course, I wonder to what extent that was a question that they had reflected on previous, because of course they may be very conventionally femininely or masculinely dressed. So gender was sort of doing something, but very messy conversation around labels. You follow a thread and it all falls down.
And that's why they call us the messy middle, huh?
Or as we like to say on the podcast, liminal spaces.
Liminal spaces, yeah. The way that I actually just did a whole series on the detriments of ratioing, where you're like, I'm 10% gay and 90% straight. I'm like, oh, the long shadow that this has from the 70s and 80s when bisexual was trying to claw its way into, everyday usage. But I digress. Very sorry. Go ahead, Lynn.
It definitely feels like just this very over-looming shadow of the Kinsey scale that continues to be mentioned. And it's honestly very confusing to me when students will say like, yeah, because of the Kinsey scale. And I'm like, I didn't even mention that in class though. Like, like we're not talking about the Kinsey scale here. And I think that maybe that's just what continues looming around in terms of like 50-50. And that's what a true bisexual is, quote unquote. And as we talk about this kind of fluidity and attraction over time and how that opens us up to these life stories that are longitudinal, not just like, this is what you are in this particular moment in time. I'm also curious about how that relates to these gender identity labels. Do bi+ folks experience less attachment to their gender identity because of the sexual fluidity and the nature of attraction?
I think that's a tough one because at this point, right, so we're getting into perhaps more psychology than sociology, and I would like to square myself very strongly as a sociologist, right? So I think it's a tough one because it's hard to know sort of those internal mechanisms and thinking about causality, right? And that's not sort of what I would claim to do so much. But what I would say is that in my experience of speaking to people and, constantly reading theory, always got my nose in a book, then I would say that bi people perhaps have a different experience of gender than others, because I would argue to some extent, and I'm very interested to always hear the diverse range of opinions that come back on this, right? But I would argue that dating monogamously is a very gendered act, right? So, for example, we can think about the conventional man and woman going out on a date and sort of the expectations that are put on them in terms of who pays, who pulls out the chair, who's wearing the dress, who's speaking to the waiter, and all of these things. There's a big, long cultural pressure and cultural history that people don't have to follow, right? And most, well, I won't say most, but like a lot of people do not follow that. But that script does exist, right? And then for people who are in same gender relationships, there's perhaps some history of that to some extent in terms of some of these sort of agentic and passive roles and how they might be mapped onto older histories of gender and scripts of gender. But also there's a lot more egalitarianism that has been indicated in some research studies around things like splitting household chores, like looking after children, etc., financial money management, and so on. And so if someone is continuously entering into these two different spheres based on the partner, so if they're entering into these heterosexual scripts and then these sort of queerer scripts, then there's going to be a bit of a ping-ponging of gender experience to some extent. And I think that probably would lead to some people thinking about gender a little bit differently. And that is something that did reflect itself a little bit in the research I conducted, where people who had had this experience of dating multiple different genders kind of indicated that they didn't really enjoy the heteronormative model all that much in terms of the fixity of what was expected of them. So you date, you move in, you get engaged, you get married, you have a baby. At some point there's a house, maybe there's a dog, etc. And more so, there was an interest in not having expectation, which I think for minoritized examples of sex and relationships like queer relationships, which were, historically illegal, etc., then there can be a greater freedom of expression to some extent because there's not that same script in place. Now, obviously freedom suggests complete freedom. We're still living in a cis heteronormative society, right? So it's still got constraints on it. But interpersonally, at least between that couple, there can be a bit more of a negotiation on expectations and things like the mental load and, whatever. So all that to say, I wouldn't like to claim anything definitive, but certainly in the research and the people that I spoke to, they seem to have a pretty good understanding of gender and, gender as a social construct and gender as an experience that is dictated to some extent by sort of advertising and so on, as opposed to something innate, But there's as many types of experiences of gender as there are people in my experience. So, I wouldn't want to sort of claim that all bi people feel that way, right?
Absolutely. And, I think that something that bi folks struggle with, I'm not going to say like all of the time with, but is this idea of being outsiders. And that can be in so many different ways, right? But specifically as sexual outsiders, bi+ people often feel that way. They encounter stigma and discrimination based on their multi-gendered attractions. And as sexual outsiders, we often feel the need to either prove or hide our sexuality. Being able to find a community where they can ask questions relating to their sexual attraction seems to be the only space where these notions can receive any kind of pushback. And so that being said, Do you think that this kind of exploration and conversation can happen in the LGBT plus community broadly, or do we need bi-specific spaces?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is something that I talk about quite a lot in the book, because obviously the book that I wrote, it's called Making Space for Bi+ People, right? I actually always forget the title, so I've got it next to me just in case. But it's called Making Space for Bi+ People because in my analysis and in my thinking, I argue that there isn't enough space made for bi+ people, in terms of policy, education, sexually, LGBT communities, etc. There is typically, again, this binary thinking of straight versus gay and lesbian and, trying to split everything down the middle in that way, which squeezes bi people. And I think that this, relates to what we were just talking about around bi people feeling uncertain about their identity, because it's almost, you continuously get this kickback of like, pick a side. Are you going to join the LGBT club or not? Which means, are you going to do, are you going to go gay clubbing or not? And there's this sort of assumption that it's flattening a very diverse and multiplicitous identity possibility, right? It's flattening a narrative. So I think that, I really do relate to the statement, if you can't see it, you can't be it, which is all about representation against everything, right? We can think of this intersectionally. There needs to be broader representation of all different identities so that you can be it. It matters when we talk about things like the first woman to bring home a gold medal in a particular sport for her country, or I'm watching the Olympics right now, if you can't tell, or it matters if you talk about the first queer council member in a city council or something like that, because if you can see it, you can be it, right? It opens up a field of possibilities, which again may be constrained to you based on the kind of community that you grow up in or find yourself in at that point. So with that being said, I think that there is certainly a use to having bi-specific spaces, similar to this podcast. It's having a detailed conversation around something that people may relate to, they may have a slightly different experience to, but having that sort of cacophony of voices is helpful to sort of navigate oneself and understand oneself in relation to all of these other experiences of bisexuality. Does that sound like me? Is mine slightly different? And does that matter? And that's fine. Anyone can be bi in whatever way they want, right? I don't think that means that it can't also be done in LGBT communities. I think historically it hasn't been done in LGBT communities because there's been a sort of lot of exclusion of bi people for political reasons. You can look to the infamous holy grail of bisexual scholarship, Yoshino's article on bi-erasure for that, and discussions on sort of the exclusion of bi+ people. But I think increasingly there is a recognition and respect of bisexuality in different LGBT communities. There always has been, but I'm saying increasingly. And I think that that's to do with the fact that more people are identifying as bi nowadays, or some iteration of multi-gender attraction. So I think both. Always have both. Have as much as you can. It's like sort of a bit of a tangent, but when the Barbie movie came out, it rightly had a lot of criticism for representing a particular kind of womanhood, right? Sort of heterosexual, largely white, middle class, affluent, etc. But I found myself thinking, it's not that the Barbie movie is bad, it's that we just need more narratives. We just need more stories to draw on. We just need more representations. And I think the same thing is the case to move from feeling like a sexual outsider to just someone, like just someone who has sexual experiences, desires, attractions, wishes, whatever.
I do want to also ask you about your paper, Social Media Use Among Bisexuals and Pansexuals, Connection, Harassment, and Mental Health, that came out in 2022, because I think even though the data is from 2016 and also was focused in Australia, it's very relevant. We have bi people engaging in, I'm thinking specifically online, on threads. That's where we are right now, in queer threads. And it's fascinating and also a little disheartening to watch a bi+ person ask a question about the bi+ experience to other bi people and immediately get dogpiled on by people who are not bi+ from the queer community. We watched this happen this weekend where this bi+ cisgender woman was sort of bemoaning the fact that it's so hard to date women because I don't look queer, and that just got brigaded by a whole bunch of folks who are like, well, that's because you haven't decentered men. That's because it's your fault. It's your fault. It's your fault. Where they were really just asking for support from other bi+ people. And then, of course, we got in the mix and we made a lot of people upset. But basically, we're like, here's the data. This is what happens when erasure occurs. This is what happens when biphobia occurs. And folks were not enjoying that at all. And I wonder what you think a good intervention is to that. Like, as a bi+ person existing in the world, especially online, what can we do to not insulate isolate ourselves, because it's important to engage in conversation, but like, how do we amplify our voices so that we don't have to be like, yes, I'm bisexual. Yes, I'm bisexual again and again and again and again.
Okay, you're getting me into my intricately queer thoughts on the digital spaces. So this is a can of worms, which I could go on for at length. But I've been inspired recently by reading quite a lot of work by people who sort of put themselves in the line of, creative technologies or digital architects. Like, I'm going to butcher their titles, but, people who are really considering theoretically what digital space does, and increasingly in conversation with queer theory as a body of work and sort of what that means for digital spaces. I've also been reading Jenny Odell's book, How to Do Nothing, recently, which is strongly recommend, really good book. It's basically arguing that not all time has to be productive, which is very helpful for anyone else in academia. But through having these sort of interesting conversations with these people who I find in very different disciplines to me, talking about what digital world should look like, they've increasingly come up with, and there's an idea that I keep being open to, this idea of what should the internet look like, and is social media a good? Right. And I haven't decided one way or another where I fall on this, but I think that there's a very provocative idea, which I find very interesting, which is that the open access to sort of having everyone in the world be able to hear your voice is not necessarily a great thing. In the sense of, they're proposing alternative ideas such as internet networks, but they're small. Like maybe there's 100 people, almost like a server style thing where you can communicate and it's sort of inward facing. It's a very interesting idea, which I won't sort of belabor too much because I'll completely omit all of the technical detail that's necessary and interesting here, but I recommend looking into it. And I think that there's something there about sort of having conversations publicly versus having conversations in safe communities, particularly for those who are seeking support, resources, education, etc. Now, fundamentally, of course, I would love for that to be possible, to have those kind of conversations in open network forums and, to have the range of experience and support that can come from that. But given that there's such a everlasting, it feels, strain of biphobia or resistance towards the potentiality of bisexuality without it being some kind of like mole sent in by heterosexuals, it feels like, then unfortunately, I think that some of these spaces are better off, protected to some extent. So I have to admit, I've become increasingly offline over the last few years, but having sort of small interest groups on whatever or hashtags to follow, etc., are one helpful way of doing that. And you can see it on TikTok. The moment you end up on queer TikTok, then you're doing something right, in my book. But there's sort of these spaces, they could be a bit more curated based on perhaps who's able to see it or who you choose to follow or what hashtags you follow. And dropping into these spaces that are almost already curated is a safe way of finding this information. Unfortunately, lots of people suck on the internet, and lots of people will sort of make horrible comments because, you can sort of do that under a guise of anonymity and so on. And there's increasing issues with that in the UK for various reasons around gender identity at the moment, and sort of the safety to be able to be and say anything on the internet without getting doxxed is increasingly restrictive if you have particular opinions and beliefs around gender identity. So I don't necessarily have a great answer for digital emancipation around sexuality and gender. I think it's a deeply intricate and complex issue, which in some ways starts from the institutional level around sort of having better moderation and having better community care policies within the network. But that in itself is very difficult because it requires the institution to take a position right off the bat in terms of, accepting things like trans identities as fine, which in the UK is very contentious still. So it's not something I think can be solved overnight. But basically, with all of this, I'm loving this idea of the small internet of like 100 people where you don't have an instant refresh tick and an ability to scroll endlessly, but rather there may be one post every 3 days because there's only 100 people and they're probably busy. It's quite a fun idea. I recommend looking into it more.
I am geeking out so hard on this idea of smaller internet spheres. It was the literature that I started, I want to say skimming when I was still doing school in Puerto Rico. And that was incredibly interesting. And I've had to pause it because master's degree and I just got into a PhD. But it is such an interesting topic to explore and approach it from a semi-public perspective instead of just a free-for-all kind of thing that social media has kind of become so far. But returning a little bit back to the conversation about relationships and the genderedness in monogamous dating, bi+ folks do not adhere very well to conventional monosexist views of sexuality being directed towards only one gender. And I'm thinking right now about your term sexual renegades in the book and that exploration. What are some nuances that only bi+ people can bring to the table in terms of the relationship between gender and sexuality, especially as it pertains to the relationship escalator in monogamous dating?
Yeah, so I use this phrase sexual renegades to refer to people who may have been able to push back or step outside of this common scripting of gender and sexuality identity, right? So it's kind of a term I use in contrast to the feeling of being a sexual outsider. So where a sexual outsider is consistently othered, a sexual renegade is able to sort of set the direction of how they want to experience sexuality and gender themselves. Maybe they've sort of dissembled these cultural ideas of what it could and should be and have a little bit more freedom in some ways. I don't think it's like sort of 100% a positive term. You know, what I mean is it's not better to be a sexual renegade than it is to be a sexual outsider. It's just a different approach to understanding sexuality or gender, right? So it's how I use the term in the text. And in terms of what that means, that we're a sexual renegade to enter into a relationship and have these potentially more explosive thoughts around sexuality and gender, we should ask my partner. No. No, in all seriousness, I think that there is a lot that could be brought there. I wouldn't, again, you know, I'm an academic, I have to add nuance here, but I don't think it's necessarily exclusive to bi people who are sexual renegades, right? Like if you've got someone who's deeply queer in one way or another, they may have similar feelings. And also cis heterosexual people consistently renegotiate conversations, as we've seen based on like the wealth of feminist theory that exists relating to things like motherhood and labor and domestic labor and so on. So I don't want to say it's exclusive to bi people, right? But I think that the potentiality for bi people who have thought deeply around sexuality and gender in these kind of almost utopian ways of like, what else could it be, right? What else could be happening? Are going to be able to offer counter narratives to a lot of scripts, and in that freedom, because my personal opinion around gender is that it is a very restrictive series of categories that dictates experience, dress, behavior, how you'll be received, representation, etc. You know, it's restrictive for me. And obviously that's probably why one of the ways in which I've stepped into being non-binary and identifying more closely with that, because it's about sort of renegotiating a lot of these possibilities and expectations. And I think that in the context of a relationship, that could look 1,000 different ways. You know, thinking about just even stepping away from cultural narratives. Should we have children? You know, is that something that we want to do or not? Do we need to get married? What about sort of different sexual acts we might want to perform? You know, for example, moving away from, if it was a heterosexual relationship, moving to more diverse forms of sexual expression in the couples and so on. It could impact anything from top to bottom, you know, in the range of ways that people interact in relationships, because I believe, as a scholar of gender, that our world is so deeply gendered that that's one of the fundamental scripts in terms of how we interact with each other. So if you're in a position where gender is different and experienced differently, and you have been in these multiplicitous different gendered relationships historically, then it's probable that you're going to bring some of those experiences to the table in terms of renegotiating what a relationship could look like. Again, I don't think you have to be bi to do this. I think that many people are well equipped to do that. But I think that that experience is going to be an interesting catalyst in facilitating some of those conversations, perhaps.
Yeah. And, you know, something that I want to tease out is, you know, on the podcast that we are actively trying to bring in how bisexuality informs all areas of our life. And it's often difficult to describe the openness that being bisexual allows you to bring into every other dimension we experience. So outside of just relationships, what would you say a bi+ worldview is?
Challenging question. I mean, I think that there's a lot of different threads that could be put into this, right? And again, it totally depends on the bi person. There are as many worldviews as there are people. There's as many sort of potentialities as there are people. There's as many different things of importance that there are people. For example, some of the people I interviewed when conducting the research said that their bisexuality was no longer important to them because they'd sort of got past the point of being a sexual renegade, as I previously used, and had completely normalized their bisexuality to the point that they don't don't need to think about it anymore. That was their experience. They were in a long-term relationship. They didn't need to worry about it anymore. And as a consequence, their gender took the fall in how they shaped their worldview, right? So there's definitely an intersectional thing to consider here of what matters most, right? And, I explain this sometimes when I'm explaining intersectionality to my students. I'm Welsh, right? I'm from Wales. And I went to my undergraduate university in the United States. And people were really obsessed with the fact that I was Welsh. They would mimic my accent back to me. They would ask me about Harry Potter. It was the forefront thing of my identity when I was in the US. And then, of course, when I moved to England, people don't care. It was the least important thing about me at that point because of the sort of proximity to Wales, right? And this is, important in terms of what we're thinking about worldview. Which thing is coming to the forefront? Which thing are you needing to navigate in this particular circumstance? But, in terms of returning to like what a bi worldview could be, I think that it could be a sense of openness and a sense of possibility. So one of my favorite authors, whose name is escaping me, I'm sure one of you will remember in a moment, they were cruising Utopia. And he writes, queerness is a possibility. It's not yet here. It's a utopia, right? Because in being queer, you are committing to a potential freedom in the future, a potential world where you could be anything, be with anyone, and it not matter and it not take sort of precedence or be political in any way. And I think that a bi worldview is one thing that commits to that, right? That gender and sexuality need not be so inextricably tied together in this sort of cis heterosexual matrix, that there is possibility for pleasure in many forms, love in many forms, and openness to so many different ways of being. And I think that that would be sort of one nugget of what could be a worldview. But it's almost like quilting. You could get so many different sort of patchwork experiences of what this could look like. But I think fundamental is that openness to it could be different tomorrow, and it might be different tomorrow. And thinking about one's own attraction, the potential futures, etc. Can either of you remember that author?
Absolutely. Esteban Muñoz.
Yeah.
My latest work is on bi+ spaces as utopias, as queer utopias. It is amazing. And I especially love the focus on the mundane in his work as queer.
Absolutely. Yeah. That every day, the sense of repetition, but always wishing for something more and working towards that. In claiming bisexuality, you do not just accept that you're in this particular relationship right now and this is the end of your identity, right? You engage with a world of possibility and sort of almost an ecological relationship to others that is so much more networked than this sort of dyadic, your coupling ends there. And I think in some ways, this is getting a little bit abstracted now, but I think in some ways that's a healthier way of being, that you don't sort of fix your entire world on your current partner to some extent. There's always, I think it's healthy to have a life outside of your partner. That's not to say sort of polyamory versus monogamy and the complexities of that, but rather it's just healthy to have a life outside of your partner.
Period. Absolutely, period.
It just is.
Yeah.
And a flexible relationship with time as it comes and goes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, Dr. Nelson, we are very curious what is up next for you outside of this new Sage textbook. Anything else you'd like to mention?
Currently, I'm plugging away at the Sage textbook. It's actually, I will say, people's eyes tend to glaze over when I talk about both textbook and qualitative methodologies.
Not here.
But I have to say, I'm having so much fun writing it.
Good.
I absolutely love it. It's queer and feminist approaches to qualitative research. It just feels really juicy because I'm kind of tackling all of these power dynamics implicit in research that people like to pretend aren't there because they like to pretend research is objective and endlessly rigorous. That rigor can still exist while accepting that researchers are people, right? Anyway, so I'm getting into all of that. Beyond that, then what else? I'm plugging away on a few articles. I've got a few research grants on the go. I'm beginning to think about LGBT researchers and how it is to research one's own identity and sort of the implications on selfhood for that. But yeah, best place to find me and watch this space is on my Twitter or, X account now, which is Rosie_they. Or just, continuously check my rather dull-looking university platform page for publications.
And all of this will be in the show notes for those of you who want to and should follow Dr. Nelson. But every episode, we like to do a call to action for allies, for bi+ people, and for LGBT+ organizations. And today, we would like to ask you, what advice would you give these three populations? Just in general, it doesn't have to be about gender and its intersection with sexuality, but...
In general, I would say for those who want to work on sexuality and gender in any kind of policy, education, research, whatever, just consider where bisexual people fit, because there's a lot of research which labels itself as LGBT, which is actually only focusing on lesbian and gay. There's a lot of research that focuses on heterosexuality, which is also open to potential experiences of bisexuality. And thinking about policy, are you actually reflecting bisexual experiences in what you're doing right now, or are you only catering towards a restricted understanding of lesbian and gay? There is a difference. So that would be my snippet.
This has been such an amazing conversation on the bi+ experience, the intersection of sexual fluidity and gender fluidity, and how that relates into relationships and our everyday lives. This was so extremely rewarding and a dream come true for this academic. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rosie. We look forward to reading more of your work as it comes available to the public. I am very eager to get my hands on this new book on methods. Yes. And we really do want to thank you personally for embodying the bisexual killjoy spirit as you continue asking these critical questions in sexuality studies and actively incorporate and do bisexual specific work. We know that it is needed and wanted and imperative today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning into Bisexual Killjoy, where we do know that bisexuality isn't a phase, it's a phenomenon. Thank you again for listening. If there's something you want us to talk about, let us know. To support us, you can share us with your friends, subscribe to our Substack, and rate our podcast, preferably 5 stars. Help spread the phenomenon. And we do want to hear from you. Share your stories with us on Instagram or via email at bisexualkilljoy@gmail.com. And until then, keep being a bisexual killjoy.
Stay bisexual and stay strong.